In 1845, two of the world's most advanced ships of their time, the HMS Erebus and the aptly named HMS Terror, set sail from England on a mission to find the Northwest Passage. The crew was of 129 men, and they carried enough provisions to last 3 years. They were outfitted with cutting-edge technology. Their boats had reinforced hulls, steam engines for propulsions, and heating systems to fend off the brutal cold. But when the men entered the icy expanse of the Arctic 14 months after leaving England, the unthinkable happened. The ships became trapped, locked in a frozen tomb that refused to release them. This would go on for 2 years, with many men succumbing to a mystery illness and others resorting to cannibalism. Finally, the men make the decision to abandon their vessel and trek across the endless, unyielding ice in a desperate bid for survival. It's here on the ice, history loses track of the Franklin expedition. What happened remained a mystery for years, until one of the many rescue expeditions sent uncovered journals hidden under rocks and the scattered remains of the deceased. Over the years, scientists have been able to put together the last moments of this expedition, but what's been uncovered over the last 100 years still doesn't answer major questions, like how did the most well-equipped expedition of its time descend into utter chaos? What unseen forces drove them to the absolute edge of humanity? This is the story of the Franklin expedition, a journey that began with glory and ended in the frozen silence of the Arctic. You're really going to want to stick around for this. This story is absolutely epic. On May 19, 1845, Sir John Franklin stood on the deck of the Erebus, gazing out over the bustling harbor. His mind was brimming with excitement. At 59 years old, Franklin was older than most who attempted the brutal, uncharted Arctic, yet he was as resolute as ever. Years of exploration had hardened him. A man who had charted coastlines, weathered storms, and even survived shipwrecks. This wasn't his first trip to the Arctic, but now he was taking on the greatest feat of his career, finding the fabled Northwest Passage, the elusive route through the Arctic that would link Europe and Asia, promising wealth and strategic power for Britain. On board the Erebus and her sister ship, the Terror, the crew moved with a purpose, securing the supplies, checking equipment, and exchanging glances that hinted at a shared resolve. The men were handpicked for this journey, each one hardened and skilled in his own way. It had been a bit of a rush to get everything prepared in time for their departure. It was said that from the time the funding was approved for the trip, they only had 7 weeks to get ready. Now, Franklin's second in command, Captain Francis Crozier, was a quiet and formidable figure, an Irishman and a seasoned Arctic navigator. Crozier was a man who balanced Franklin's optimism with a cautious realism. Said that Crozier might have actually even been more qualified to lead this expedition, but he was not allowed to because he was Irish. Now, Franklin knew the Arctic's dangers very well. He had led previous expeditions into its frigid waters. Though loyal to Franklin, Crozier harbored a sense of quiet foreboding, feeling that the icy north was not a place to be taken so lightly. On board, there was also Dr. Stephen Stanley, the ship's surgeon, known for his calm demeanor and steady hand. As a doctor, he'd witnessed how the Arctic could whittle down even the strongest of men. His medical knowledge was completely invaluable. For a lot of the men who were younger on the boat, this was an adventure of a lifetime. They had heard stories of other expeditions, some that didn't turn out so well, but still, in that time, this was like a big honor. Now, it was said that Franklin had an air of confidence about him that was almost contagious. Again, this is something that Crozier often pushed back on. He didn't share the same confidence that things were going to be so easy on this journey. Franklin, ever the optimist, was particularly confident because of the British ingenuity behind the design of these ships. These were naval vessels that were originally designed for battle, so they were fortified with iron plating, and they had been upgraded to include heated cabins and even propellers. Now, this is a pretty rare luxury for just about any ship in that time, and be able to have a heated cabin in the Arctic. On board the vessel, they also had a saltwater still for making drinking water. And unlike other expeditions around that time that would take things like salted pork and hardtack as their main source of supply, on this expedition, they were going to take tons and tons, like 3 years worth of canned fruit and vegetables and meat to keep off the scurvy and to keep the men healthy. So this was a first for everybody involved that we're going to be eating canned food for the next 3 years. But alas, the ship set sail, and the last place that they will stop over at is in Stromness in Scotland. And from here, they head straight towards the Canadian Arctic. And by late September of 1845, the Erebus and Terror made a lot of progress. And somewhere before Baffin Island, around July of 1845, they run into the whaling ship, the Enterprise and the Prince of Wales. These two ships are the last two to ever see the crew alive. It's said that the crew of the Terror and the Erebus give them the all okay symbol as they went past each other, and this will be the last known sighting of these ships. But from what was pieced together by late September of 1845, they did seem to make a lot of promising progress through the Arctic waters. After parting ways with the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, the HMS Erebus and Terror pressed onwards, navigating the treacherous waters of the Lancaster Sound and heading west into uncharted territory. By late August, the ships reached Beechey Island, a sheltered area where Franklin decided to anchor for the winter of 1845 and 1846. Here, the crew worked tirelessly to maintain the ships and keep morale high, even as the 24-hour darkness of the Arctic closed in. It's here the expedition would suffer the loss of the first men. 3 would perish to an unknown and mysterious illness that Dr. Stanley and Francis Crozier started to suspect could be either scurvy or possibly contaminated canned food. Having no choice but to push on, and with the return of sunlight in the spring of 1846, the ice began to break. The expedition would resume its push westward. The ships made promising progress throughout the Arctic waters that summer, their reinforced hulls cutting through thinner patches of ice. In a push to avoid thicker ice packs, they do divert their route further south. As daylight began to wane and the temperatures drop, Franklin could start to feel a shift in the journey. His previous expeditions taught him the signs of winter approaching. The sluggish pull of the current, the first whiffs of sea ice forming, all of these things were the Arctic's quiet warning. And one evening in a heavy fog that cloaked the entire area, Franklin stood on deck gazing out into the gray expanse. There was a crackling tension in the air as if the sea itself was on the verge of freezing solid beneath them. Crozier joined him, his quiet presence grounding Franklin in his own quiet thoughts. They exchanged only a few words. Crozier, ever cautious, asked if they should consider pulling back further south until winter. But Franklin dismissed his suggestion with a nod and a reassuring word. The ice has always been unpredictable, Francis. If we hold our course, we'll be through this soon enough. It was an optimism grounded in his decades of experience, but as he turned back to his cabin that night, he felt a trace of uncertainty settle into his chest. That evening, Franklin took his journal and started scribbling down notes about weather and the ship's position. He paused, pen hovering above the page, and wrote,
"The season closes in, and the ice forms around us faster than expected, but spirits remain high. We must press on."
He set down his pen, the words a kind of reassurance for himself as much as his men. At this point of the trip, Franklin and his men had been at sea for over a year. They had already spent one winter in relative comfort anchored off of Beechey Island, but now, coming into the second winter, things seemed much more unpredictable. And within days, the Arctic made its intentions unmistakably clear. The men awoke one morning to Erebus and Terror held fast in a sheet of solid ice. Franklin ordered the crew onto the ice to start assessing their position. It's at this point that Franklin realizes they're stuck here for the winter. There's no getting out at this time, and he essentially directs the men to start setting up for the winter and start dividing up the food so they can ration it out over the next few months. Inside the ship, Franklin, though, could feel a nagging worry. In his quiet moments, he would look at the maps spread before him and think how much they still didn't know. They'd done their best to navigate where they were, but they were in uncharted territory, and he was trying to essentially figure out where he was in relation to the Northwest Passage. The ship had become stuck about 120 kilometers off of King William Island, which is remote, pretty much desolate island in the middle of nowhere, and almost 1,300 kilometers from where those last two ships had actually crossed paths with it. In July, the year before, the ship had become stuck in something called the Victor Strait, which is about at the midway point through the Northwest Passage. An important note, the Northwest Passage isn't one route, it's potentially multiple different routes depending on the season. Now, during that time, the Northwest Passage, to picture the geography of the area, it's like trying to interweave a boat through a series of hundreds and hundreds of small islands and trying to find the ones that don't have ice in between it, which is pretty much impossible in the winter, but during the right times of year, there was areas that were ice-free. So if you took the wrong left, you could easily end up in a place that freezes up quicker or later, which seems to be the case for these guys. So over the next few weeks, the ice would only thicken, further encasing the ships with a strength that started to test the iron reinforced hulls. Franklin made a point daily of walking among the crew, speaking with each man, and trying to offer them a word of reassertion. The younger sailors, still full of bravado, grinned back, eager to prove their mettle. But Franklin started to notice quiet glances among his officers, the unease lurking behind their stoic expressions. The reality was starting to set in that they were truly trapped, perhaps until the next year. And that's under the assumption that the ice melts enough in the Canadian summer to let the ships free of its grip. Now, as the men start to adjust to the early signs of winter, a new concern begins to emerge among the crew. Some of the sailors were starting to show symptoms that couldn't be ignored. Swollen gums, unusual fatigue, and a pervasive sense of weakness that seemed to suck out all their energy. Franklin knew these telltale signs: scurvy, a common affliction of long voyages. But it didn't make sense. They had packed plenty of preserved food, hundreds of tin meat cans that were meant to sustain them through the harshest of conditions. Rumors began to swirl amongst the crew that maybe something was wrong with the food. As it was said, many of the cans were actually rotten, and some of them had a metallic sheen that left a lot of the men uneasy. Franklin would assure the men that it had all been prepared to the highest of standards, but privately, I think he even worried. Was there something wrong with the food and water supply that was adding yet another threat to their already perilous journey? It didn't really matter at that point, because it's all they had. But all that could be done at that time was monitor the men's health and try to get them the proper nutrition that they needed. And it's not like there was a lot to hunt or fish for, especially with everything being frozen, but they weren't exactly in an area on that frozen ice pack that was going to be full of wildlife. By the time winter had fully set in, the Erebus and Terror had become islands of humanity in an endless expanse of ice and snow. Life on board settled into a routine, though it was a routine forged by survival rather than comfort. The men kept themselves busy rotating through shifts of maintenance, food preparation, and repairs, doing what they could to stay warm and active. Despite the severe cold and the rationing, there was a lot of camaraderie among the men. At mealtimes, the men would gather in the mess, clutching tin cups and thin broth, along with some trading stories of home, sharing a rare laugh. Among the officers, Captain Crozier and Dr. Stanley were Franklin's closest confidants. Crozier, often with his cautious gaze, kept a close eye on the supplies and rations, and Dr. Stanley did everything in his power to troubleshoot this mysterious illness. He quite often voiced his concerns to Franklin, wondering if both the stores would last through the winter or if maybe they weren't tainted. So Crozier often voiced his concerns that more of the food supply was tainted than they expected, and that they were really going to have to watch the rations if they wanted everyone to live. Now, Dr. Stanley, the ship's surgeon, found himself insanely busy tending to frostbitten hands, treating coughs, and also providing medical treatment to the men who kept mysteriously falling ill. He knew the limits of his ability given the isolation, and he started to worry that this mystery illness was actually getting worse and the men were becoming weaker and weaker. But for now, all he could do was manage what he could. There were moments of cheer and even humor among the crew. Everyone was hopeful that with the arrival of summer, the ship would be broken free and they could finish their journey and head on home. Now, as the return of daylight came with the spring, a renewed hope grew in the men that the ice would melt and their ship would finally be free. But as the months wore on and the ice refused to melt, cracks began to form in the group's morale. The summer of 1846 came and went with no thought, and the realization sank in: the Erebus and Terror were not going anywhere. Now, this isn't that uncommon in this part of the Arctic for there to be multi-year ice, where it doesn't melt in the summer And unfortunately, they happened to be in a spot in the Victor Strait where this was fairly common. The once jovial mess hall grew quieter. The rations of canned goods and occasional scraps of dried vegetables became monotonous and insufficient. Scurvy, a once distant threat, began to rear its head, its telltale signs appearing in the men who had been strong and healthy just months before. Franklin's steadfast optimism was a light for many, but even he wasn't immune to the toll of the Arctic. And in June of 1847, after a year and a half on the ice, Sir John Franklin succumbed to his illness, likely to a combination of malnutrition and just sheer exhaustion. His death left a void aboard the ships, and one that now Francis Crozier, the Irishman, had to fill. Now, Crozier was seasoned and pragmatic. He took command with a quiet determination, but the burden of leadership was fairly immense, especially now that the supplies were starting to dwindle. They're at the halfway point of their rations. Like, they had 3 years and they're about 1.5 years in. And they know that they're going to likely have to winter an entire other year. In just a few short months, temperatures would begin to plummet again into the unimaginable lows of the Arctic. They would also have to deal with the psychological toll of another season of 24/7 darkness. Men began to fall ill at an alarming rate. Stanley started to really suspect something was wrong with the provisions. But unfortunately, they just didn't have the equipment or the knowledge at that time to really troubleshoot this problem and figure it out. They didn't have a choice. So again, Crozier being pragmatic, he divvies up the rations and they planned ahead. They barely make it through another winter. And by April of 1848, the situation had become undeniably dire. Now, for 2 years, the Erebus and Terror had been trapped in that dense ice pack off of King William Island, locked in an unyielding Arctic ice. Each season had brought with it only the slightest shifts in the ice around them, and despite hopes for a thaw that might free the ships, it wouldn't come before they ran out of food and supplies. Now, with many of the men showing signs of scurvy, with Franklin passed away, Francis has to take command and he has to make some brazen decisions. Crozier gathers the officers and starts to discuss the options. They were surrounded by vast unbroken fields and miles of ice in every single direction. There was no known civilization around them. To the north, the ice was thick and stable, a continuous barrier that stretched basically up to the North Pole. If they attempted to push through that way, there wasn't a whole lot of hope of progress. They would likely just starve and succumb to the elements. To the east, there was some open water in areas where the ice fractured, but it was far and few in between. These areas were said to be unreliable and riddled with pressure cracks and sharp ridges that could swallow you whole. Crozier may have hoped that they could reach the waters around Fury and Hecla Strait, an area where summer usually melts the ice and creates channels to the open water, but it was over 300 miles away, and they had neither the provisions or the health to make it that far. If only they had been a little further west. Crozier thought there would have been a path to escape. He reflected on how a slightly different course may have led them into the Beaufort Sea or southwards towards the coast of Alaska. Here they would have reached warmer waters or at least land that provided some resources, some chance at hunting, some chance of gathering wood for heat. But the ice pack 120 kilometers from King William offered none of that. No food, no shelter. The bitter reality set in that no path forward was going to be easy. After hours of discussion, Crozier finally gives the order they're going to abandon the ships. It was a decision none of them took lightly because they knew they were likely going to die. They would carry what they could, including the lifeboats, what they put on sledges, and they filled it with provisions and tools that they could use to survive. They would attempt to make it southwards towards a place called Back River, a hope that seemed distant but attainable. Crozier knew in his heart that this was their last gamble. The Back River, known to the Inuit as the Great Fish River, was about 150 miles from their current position, half the distance that it would have been to the Fury and Hecla Straits. Back River is located at the Chantry Inlet, and following the Back River would lead the entire crew into mainland and interior Canada, where resources would be plentiful, there would be fresh water, and they would be able to get assistance from Inuit communities. For the starving and weakened men, the Back River represented a last hope, but it wasn't going to be easy. with many of the men already starving and most of them feeling the effects of the mystery illness. Many men were pale and thin with hollow eyes and sluggish movements. Even those who had been strong and vital at the outset of the journey were mere shells of themselves. It wasn't just scurvy, this was something worse, but they couldn't figure it out. Many sailors were complaining of dizziness, sharp stomach pains, and this strange taste in their mouth. Crozier suspected something worse, but again, there wasn't a lot of time for thinking. Whatever its cause, it was clear that their only chance to fix it was escaping the grip of the Arctic's ice. The men gathered the gear. There was a mix of emotions among them. Some were bitter and resentful, unwanting to leave the ships, while others were excited to go, willing to abandon anything just to get off the ice. Crozier felt the weight of every man's gaze upon him. He knew most of them likely wouldn't survive the journey, especially the frailest among them. At the time that they had left the two ships behind, 29 men had already passed away from starvation and the illness, and the remaining 105 would make their way across the Arctic ice. As the men of the Franklin expedition pressed southward, across the vast and yielding ice, each step felt like a betrayal of their once hopeful mission. Starvation gnawed at their insides, and the brutal cold bit through every layer, piercing their skin and their bone alike. Crozier's every decision weighed heavily, knowing that every choice, every direction taken, every ration counted, could be the one that determined if a man lived or died. One day, they reached a crossroads in the ice. To the right, they could make it for a stretch of rough, uneven terrain, difficult to navigate but more direct. To the left lay flatter ground, offering an easier path, curving them slightly off course. Crozier deliberated, glancing back at the man, weak and frostbitten, barely able to stand under the weight of their own survival gear. He chose the flatter path, hoping to conserve energy for the men. But soon he would realize that this decision added miles to their journey, miles they could scarcely afford. Some began to mumble in frustration, questioning his judgment. But Crozier said nothing. He just kept moving the men forward. Though the food was rationed sparingly, it wouldn't last long, and days blurred together as they trudged across the barren white expanse, which offered them no food and no shelter, and definitely not any solace. Some men were said to leave. Some men would lose their fingers and toes to frostbite, and others who were no longer able to keep up were left behind, left to the silence of the Arctic. The last known days of the crew in this expedition were ones faced by absolute starvation and illness, like very weak people, barely able to move. It wasn't good. And a few of the men even tried to leave markers of their passing, small cairns or stone piles where they could record notes from the expedition. A group left a note at a cairn at some place called Victory Point, dated April 25th, 1848. This note was a brief final summary of the dire situation. It spoke of Sir John Franklin's death the previous June, and it recorded the decision of the 105 men to abandon ships, making for the Back River. Chillingly, the note details the harrowing loss of 29 crew members up to this point, and now they faced a perilous trek across frozen ice to make it to mainland Canada. They left the ships not for exploration, not to chart new territories, but in a final attempt to survive. This note was one of the last factual records of the expedition and a testament to the quiet determination and hopeless courage of the men sticking together. So now that the men had spent 1847 and 1848 stuck 120 kilometers off King William Island, Crozier couldn't help but wonder what people would think when they found these notes, these last clues of their expedition. They had actually left notes too at a place called Beechy Island in their very first winter. The first note to Beechy Island was ironically one updating saying that the crew was good and everyone was doing well, though a few men had died. And then almost a year later, someone had traveled back to Beechy Island and actually left another note updating that cairn with a message saying that they had lost Sir Franklin during the expedition, but they were going to continue on. And now here we are in 1848, a few years later, and the notes being left are those that are completely desperate of people dying of illness and trying to cross hundreds of miles of frozen ice in search of salvation. The men were sick from this mystery illness. They were starving and hauling those sledges that would have weighed hundreds, if not thousands of pounds. would have been almost impossible. The weight was soon too much, and the men were starting to abandon the sledges, leaving behind precious supplies scattered along the ice as they continued to push on. Some groups attempted to salvage metal scraps, hoping to fashion tools or traps, but there was no wildlife for them to even catch. There was nothing. The Arctic temperatures often plunged below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the groups started to become split up because some of the men weren't able to keep up with the others and essentially started forming smaller and smaller groups. And in desperation, what was put together is that the men were huddled together using their bodies to stave off the cold that seeped into their very bones. And accounts from later search parties who will go out and look for them started to find some of the men later on that the men were actually cutting the fabric off their clothes and trying to eat it. Anything that they had brought with them had been repurposed into some kind of tool or a tool of survival. So it's at this point, as the men are making that final push southward, their route would take them south along the shore of King William Island, eventually crossing over to mainland. There would have been absolutely no food, and walking would not have been easy. It was full of broken ice and pressure cracks, slowing the men down significantly. They would have been on the brink of absolute starvation. Historical records have the men making it about halfway to the Back River, near the Adelaide Peninsula, in a place aptly named Starvation Cove. It's where the men turn to the worst thing thinkable. They resort to cannibalism. Unclear exactly how they went about it, the men slowly succumbed to the cold and the elements one by one. All 105 men of that expedition losing their life near King William Island, from starvation, from that mystery illness, or from cold. What was known up to this point was put together through notes, logs, and some journals that were found in cairns left behind by the crew. There's some horrifying modern scientific discoveries that shed light on this that we'll get into towards the end of the episode. But back in England, the alarm bells would start to go off when the Franklin expedition fails to return home after 3 years. Britain starts to gather up men and start planning a rescue mission, driven by both public outcry and the government's insistence that the heroic explorers must be found. She actually said that Franklin's wife was pivotal in this, like of really advocating and pressuring the government to go out and look for these guys. So over the next decade, more than 30 search expeditions would scour the Arctic, determined to uncover the fate of the Erebus and the Terror, to search for the men who had set out with such high hopes. Search parties found haunting clues along the way. In 1850, 3 small graves were discovered on Beechey Island containing the bodies of Franklin crew members who had perished very early in the journey. This is where they wintered the very first winter in 1846, when things were still fine. But a few of the men apparently had died, and these graves were eerily well preserved, the cold Arctic ground acting as a natural tomb. The discovery of these men marked a tragic beginning, but it offered some insight as to what had happened to the befallen crew. It's here where they also find the notes in the cairn explaining that Crozier would take command and Franklin had actually passed away. But it wasn't until 1859 that a search party led by somebody named Francis Leopold McClintock made the most significant discovery yet. It was a document left in a stone cairn at King William Island, the place where they wintered for 2 years. The note was written in 1847, and it was a grim summary of the expedition's final days, not only confirming Franklin's death, but also the decision by Crozier and his men to abandon the icebound ships. The document ends abruptly, leaving a chilly silence about the expedition's ultimate fate. But McClintock's party also found scattered human remains and evidence that some of the men had attempted to march south, leaving the Erebus and Terror as they struggled to survive on foot. But the story doesn't end there, because a lot of modern investigations have revealed a series of decisions and conditions that sealed the expedition's doom, with often grim precision. Some being carried out in 1981 by Dr. Owen Beatty of the University of Alberta began to uncover some mind-boggling facts about this crew. 3 of the sailors that they were able to find on Beechey Island, John Torrington, William Berry, and John Hartnell, were well preserved enough that they could get tissue and bone samples. And this revealed in it extraordinarily high levels of lead, far exceeding what could be naturally expected from any kind of natural exposure. The findings suggest that the crew's canned food was sealed with a lead solder, which was a significant source of a contamination. The men had complained about this food and it was rushed. They tried to get this through in 7 weeks. So it looks like the food was actually poisoning the crew the entire time. Common symptoms of lead poisoning include a confusion, erratic behavior, abdominal pain, and physical weakness, which all seem to explain this mystery illness. The researchers do actually test the food itself because they find a few surviving tins, and there were some actually tested for lead contaminations. The lead levels in the food were well above safety guidelines, but even more remarkably, the lead levels in the members of the crew tested was 10 times higher than that of a normal person in that era. Though the food is considered to be the main source of lead contamination, it isn't considered to be the only source. Because Beatty's research also showed that the desalination system on board the Erebus and Terror, essentially the plant that they had for making drinking water, was using lead pipes, so that also added to the contamination. And in addition, each of the men that they tested showed a severe zinc deficiency, which also would have further weakened the men's immune system and left them vulnerable to scurvy and infections. Though in planning their diet and rations for the entire trip with the canned goods, they accounted for scurvy, but they didn't account for other nutrients that weren't as known to them at the time. As part of Beatty's expedition and also as part of expeditions into the early 1990s, led by a Dr. Ann Keenlyside, were able to find scattered bones and human bones around King William's Island where the men had wintered. And when they started analyzing these bones at Trent University, what they found was alarming. Some of the bones showed that they were cooked and cracked. Basically, essentially, people were trying to remove the marrow from the inside. And some of the bones also showed sharp cut marks like you would get from butchering meat. So these findings also match interviews that were conducted with local Inuit people who were said to have come across these stranded travelers at one point, and also described Franklin's men as resorting to cannibalism. So it seemed that at some point during the journey, during the last moments, they had to resort to eating each other, which is absolutely terrifying. And then finally, the big find comes in 2014 and 2016, when underwater archaeologists from Parks Canada made two monumental discoveries. They found, after over 100 years, the HMS Erebus in Wilmot and Crampton Bay and the HMS Terror in the aptly named Terror Bay, both off the coast of King William Island. The ships were remarkably well preserved, with many artifacts intact. Items such as Franklin's pocket watch, clothing, tools, and navigational equipment were retrieved, providing a haunting glimpse into the crew's daily lives. The ship's position suggested the crew made efforts at times to reposition them, and likely in a bid to escape the encroaching ice. The wrecks confirm the unrelenting nature of the Arctic environment. All right, I just want to thank you guys for joining in today. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you liked the video, let us know. We'll be back again next week.